I recall the night my dad passed away like it was yesterday. I was about to head out from my flat to my job at the pub where I worked as an assistant manager. I had just finished watching an episode of The Sopranos when my phone rang. For some reason, I assumed it was work, maybe asking if I could come in earlier or something unimportant, so I took my time answering. When I did, my response was casual, almost indifferent. If I had to describe that moment in one word, it would be boredom, but that feeling didn't last long. The news hit me like a truck. He had passed suddenly, without warning, from a brain clot. One moment he was fine. The next, they declared him dead on arrival. The funeral was hard. It sounds heartless, but when someone is elderly or suffering from an illness, it at least gives family and friends some time to prepare for the loss. But in our case, we didn't have that time. It felt like going from calm to grief in seconds. 1 minute, I was bored. The next, I was shattered, just from hearing, "I have bad news." So instead of the reluctant acceptance I had seen at other funerals, there was just this overwhelming shock, like everyone had been hit with something huge, and we were all walking around in a fog, unable to really process the loss. I've never been one for visiting graves. It feels pointless to me. It's more for the living than the dead, who don't even know we're doing it. Personally, I wouldn't want anyone making a fuss over me. Just raise a glass in my memory, and that's enough. But with my dad, I didn't have any closure, so I went against my own beliefs and started going to his grave. I was looking for something to hold on to, desperate to feel like he wasn't really gone. What started as weekly visits became monthly ones with the same routine. I'd drink a can of his favorite beer, chat to him a bit about my life, and leave. It never really made me feel better, but I could feel myself moving slowly through the grief, and that was something. It was small, but it helped. This little routine went on, always the same, until one day, I noticed a man I didn't recognize standing near my dad's grave. He was dressed all in black, with a long coat and a dark umbrella under his arm. I wasn't sure if he was visiting my dad or a nearby grave, but as I walked closer, he noticed me and quickly walked away toward one of the cemetery exits. Nothing seemed odd about it at first. People have the right to grieve in private, so I didn't think much of it. But then it happened again, exactly the same way. I thought it was just a coincidence the second time, but when I saw the same man a third time standing by the headstones, I started to think something strange was going on. That time, I decided to approach quietly, staying out of sight. I wanted to see if he was actually visiting my dad's grave or just one nearby. That's when I realized he was. I watched from a distance as he knelt by the headstone and touched it. I didn't recognize him from the funeral, and though I couldn't see his face clearly, I was sure he wasn't someone I knew or had met before. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to figure out what was going on. I approached as stealthily as I could, trying not to be seen. But as I got closer, he noticed me, looked startled, and started running. He bolted through the graves toward the exit. Instinctively, I chased after him. I couldn't let him disappear without knowing who he was, or why he kept visiting my dad's grave. This was my only chance to find out, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. So, there I was, sprinting through the cemetery, yelling for him to stop, telling him I just wanted to talk. Other visitors looked at me in disbelief, horrified by my disrespect for the place. But I didn't care. I knew if they were in my shoes, they'd do the same. I finally caught up with him near one of the exits and grabbed his arm, forcing him to turn around. What I saw made my stomach turn. His face, barely covered by a black scarf, looked exactly like my dad's. The resemblance was uncanny, though his posture and body language were different. When he spoke, my head spun. My dad had been from the south of England, but this man had a Scottish accent, or at least something close to it. It definitely wasn't my dad. He told me to leave him alone, then ran off again. I stood frozen, unable to chase him. My legs felt weak, not just from the running, but from the shock. After sitting down with my mom and talking it over, the only explanation we could come up with was that this man might be my dad's identical twin. My mom had seen his body, identified him at the morgue, so there was no way he could have faked his death or anything like that. But my dad had never mentioned having a brother, let alone a twin. We're looking into it now because if this guy really is my dad's long-lost sibling, I'd like to meet him soon. Throughout history, humanity has always needed a place to honor and remember those who have passed away. Whether it be the sky burials of native tribes or the fire-filled ship send-offs of ancient seafaring peoples, we have developed intricate rituals to help us cope with the loss of loved ones. More than that, we also need places to remember them. In modern times, we've built places we now call cemeteries or graveyards, marked by gravestones and memorials. These spaces are cloaked in a deep sense of mortality, places of profound reverence, with some even considering them sacred. Not many find comfort in such locations, as their connection with death has made them focal points of both historical and modern horror tales. So, it's not hard to see why few places would be worse to face a tragic end. The cruel irony of being killed in a cemetery is something that very few have endured, yet this was the terrible fate of two unlucky souls. Such was the case of Emily Louise Ward, a 16-year-old from Dayton, Indiana. Emily was a bright student and well-liked by her peers. She was known for her academic achievements, the result of her dedication, and she was active in cheerleading, driven by her passion for extracurriculars. However, as Emily entered her teenage years, her behavior began to change. Not in the usual rebellious way many teens experience, but in more worrying, reckless ways. She quit cheerleading, distanced herself from her old friends, and her teachers noticed her dwindling interest in her studies, which led to a significant drop in her grades. After some discussions, her parents concluded that her troubling behavior stemmed from her relationship with an older boy named Ryan Turner, a 19-year-old from a nearby town. There was little doubt that Ryan had a bad influence on Emily, as he introduced her to drinking and smoking, habits she had avoided up until then. The couple would often stay out late, attending loud music events and hanging around bars until they were kicked out for not having proper identification. Emily started coming home later and later, often intoxicated, and this affected her school attendance as she struggled to get up in the mornings. Her parents were at their wits' end, trying various ways to guide her back on track, but nothing seemed to work. Eventually, they decided on a drastic measure. They placed her, against her will, in a program for troubled teens on March 6, 1992. However, Emily had no intention of staying there. One cold March evening, while the staff wasn't looking, she slipped out of the facility, taking only a small bag of belongings with her. Her parents were furious at the staff for allowing such a careless escape, and they quickly contacted the local police, filing a missing persons report. Given Emily's status as a vulnerable teenager, the police treated her case with urgency. They contacted Ryan, her boyfriend, who lived hundreds of miles away. Authorities believed Emily would try to make her way to him, but when they arrived at his home, they found that he had no knowledge of her escape. This was when the police realized just how serious the situation had become. Tragically, only 2 days after her disappearance, Emily's body was found behind an old cemetery located about 25 miles away from the program she had escaped from. She had been assaulted and brutally beaten. She still wore her ring, but a necklace she often wore with the word "Hope" engraved on it was missing. In a devastating twist, Ryan, her boyfriend, was initially suspected of being involved in her death. However, early DNA testing ruled him out. The main theory investigators followed was that Emily, having no money to purchase a bus ticket, tried to hitchhike her way back to her hometown. At some point, she accepted a ride from two men. Whether she grew suspicious of them or simply changed her mind about riding with them, a chase ensued. Emily ran into the nearby cemetery, hoping to hide among the gravestones. Police found evidence that suggested she had tried to hide. One of her socks was discovered behind a gravestone, and footprints were found nearby. Her body was later found near a fence at the edge of the cemetery, where it appeared her attackers had finally caught up to her. On May 12, 2009, authorities in Charlotte, North Carolina, arrested a man named Marvin Lee Jenkins after matching his DNA to evidence found at the crime scene. He was charged with sexual assault and murder and was extradited back to Indiana to face trial. In a shocking courtroom confession in 2010, Jenkins admitted that Emily had escaped from his car and ran into the cemetery, where she tripped and fell near a fence. He claimed he had beaten her to death using a piece of a gravestone before tossing the stone over the fence. Police corroborated parts of his confession by confirming they had found blood-stained fragments of a gravestone at the scene. To avoid the death penalty, Jenkins pleaded guilty to aggravated murder and was sentenced to 35 years to life in prison. The tragic final moments of Emily Louise Ward's life, running through a cemetery, a place already so deeply connected to death, paint a grim picture. In a sickening twist, the very symbols of human mortality, gravestones, became the tools of her demise. I'm from South Carolina. Last October, marking 102 years since the end of the Great War, my University of Georgia history class took a trip to visit the graves of Allied soldiers in Belgium. It was my first time traveling overseas, aside from a short 2-day visit to Vancouver to see a friend who was attending school there. I was beyond excited to finally experience a bit of the world outside of the southern US. I even took some basic online German lessons, focusing on everyday phrases and how to ask for directions. Every time I grasped a new word or pronunciation, my excitement grew. By the time we packed up and headed for the airport, I was practically buzzing with anticipation. When we arrived, it wasn't quite the European dream I'd imagined. The weather was dreadful, and the locals, particularly in tourist areas, could be shockingly rude. It made me appreciate how friendly people could be back home. Sure, there are some people in the US who are unfriendly, but we don't usually go out of our way to correct minor mistakes from tourists trying to speak English. In Belgium, I once asked for directions to a bakery and ended up getting a 10-minute lecture from an older woman about my poor grammar. And she was actually nicer than some others who just outright ignored me or pretended not to speak English at all, even though I'd asked my questions in German. After a while, I learned to brush it off, especially when I met some genuinely kind locals who made up for the unfriendly ones. But I reminded myself that I was there to learn, to dive deeper into history by visiting these places firsthand. Our group eventually made it to a small, quiet town called St. Martin, where we visited a cemetery dedicated to American soldiers who lost their lives during the war. Over 5,000 soldiers were buried there in neatly arranged rows under a thick blanket of gray skies. We walked silently between the rows of white crosses, each marking a life lost in Europe during the war. At one point, I noticed a man standing in a separate section of grass, which didn't appear to have any gravestones. This area was labeled as Plot F, but it wasn't on the cemetery map or listed in the visitor's guide. It was as if the plot didn't officially exist. Curious, I approached the man. He was wearing an old military uniform, the kind you'd see from World War II, and I figured he must have been part of a reenactment. That's when I saw them, 96 small white markers, about the size of index cards, each with just a number on them. No names, no places of birth, just simple ID numbers. Unlike the other graves, there were no flags, no indication that these were American soldiers. It was incredibly sad, and I couldn't understand why there was so little respect shown to these men. I didn't have to wait long to find out. The men buried here aren't like the others, the man said quietly, noticing my confusion. These are the dishonored dead. He explained that these soldiers had been executed by the military after being convicted of crimes like assault or murder while stationed in Europe. I was stunned. I pointed to the small marker in front of him and asked, "Who's buried here?" "This one." He paused, his expression heavy. "A soldier from Virginia. He was caught stealing from a wealthy British landowner. An argument broke out and the landowner was shot. His name was Tom Harris." He pointed to 2 other markers and continued, "Then there's Private Brown and Corporal Davis. They attacked and killed a young girl in England. And Lewis Till, a black soldier executed for allegedly killing an Italian woman." The name Lewis Till sounded familiar. "Till?" I asked. "As in Emmett Till?" "Yes," he replied solemnly. "Lewis Till was Emmett's father. He was hanged overseas when Emmett was just a child. It's a grim coincidence, isn't it? Both father and son, taken in such brutal ways." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the same Emmett Till whose mother famously held an open casket funeral to show the world the horror of what had been done to her son. To think she lost both her husband and her son to violence in such a similar tragic way. It was hard to comprehend. How could anyone endure that kind of pain? As I stood there, the man's words haunted me. It felt like fate, like a dark, twisted thread connected the father's and the son's deaths. It was unsettling in a way I'd never experienced before, making me question everything I thought I knew about life, destiny, and the world. After I left high school early and moved out of my parents' home, I was desperate for a job. At that point, I would have taken just about any gig to cover rent. That's why I consider myself either fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you view it, that the local burial ground was looking for workers. The older employees, who had been there for decades, couldn't understand why someone my age would want to dig graves. The work was tough, especially on the back, but I adapted quickly. It was like having a free gym membership rather than a real job. I started building muscle fast. Honestly, it only felt like work when the weather was bad or when there was a funeral. Otherwise, it was nice being outdoors. The layout of the cemetery was pretty straightforward. Most of the graves were standard plots, all the same size and cost. But in the far northwest corner, there was a private section with larger, fancier plots. These were for the wealthier families, and the local funeral director made a lot of money selling elaborate setups to them. We rarely went to that part of the cemetery unless it was for cleaning or upkeep, and I was never assigned those tasks. The older guys didn't trust me with the special cleaning agents used to keep the marble and metal fixtures looking pristine. So, it was strange when I got a call on one of my days off asking if I had been near that area recently. My boss sounded furious, and he didn't hold back when asking if I had been fooling around in the northwest plots. I told him I hadn't, that the last time I was there was months ago when I watched one of the veterans demonstrate how to use the marble cleaner as part of my training. He seemed confused and frustrated. When I asked what was going on, he told me we'd discuss it when I came in. I was anxious but confident I hadn't done anything wrong. When I arrived at work a couple of days later, the tension in the air was thick. I could tell something serious had happened. My boss walked me over to the northwest plots without saying a word, and I knew not to speak until I found out what was happening. We saw one of the workers tending to a grave, and then my boss asked if I'd been hanging out in the area during lunch, maybe snacking near the graves. He reminded me that eating near the graves could attract animals, which could damage the burial sites. Then he dropped the bombshell. Something had tried to dig up a freshly buried grave in the northwest corner. He said something because we could tell by the marks that it wasn't done by a person with tools, it was done by claws. The dirt was rough, with jagged edges, unlike the straight lines you'd expect from a shovel. It was clearly some kind of animal. We couldn't have families finding out that wild animals were disturbing their loved ones' graves. It would cause outrage. So we had an emergency meeting. The general belief was that a scavenger animal, like a coyote or maybe even a stray dog, had been digging at night. The solution was obvious. We needed someone to keep watch overnight until the issue was resolved. And guess who got volunteered for the job? That's right, me, the youngest and newest worker. The only perk was that night shifts paid double, and I could use the extra money. That first night of watch was miserable. All I had was a strong thermos of coffee and a pellet gun another worker lent me to scare off any animals. It was boring, lonely, and felt like it would never end. But after adjusting my sleep schedule, it got a bit easier. On the second to last night of my watch, I was doing a routine patrol near the northwest plot when I saw movement, frantic limbs digging at the ground. I could have yelled or shot the pellet gun in the air to scare whatever it was away. But if I took care of the problem too soon, I'd lose out on the extra pay. So I crept closer, turning off my flashlight and moving quietly toward the figure. I'd hunted small animals with my uncle before, so I planned to use my flashlight to startle the creature long enough to get a clear shot. But when I flicked on the light, I froze in terror. It wasn't an animal at all. It was a person, crouched on all fours, digging with their bare hands. I was too stunned to even aim the rifle. Instead, I started shouting, telling them to get out of there or I'd call the police. The person stopped but didn't run out of fear. The look they gave me wasn't of fright, but of pure rage, like they were furious I had interrupted them. I swear, if I hadn't had that rifle, I don't know if I'd still be here to tell this story. The other workers didn't believe me when I told them what happened. Some admitted I might have seen something, but they doubted it was a person. I understand why they were skeptical, but I know what I saw. The police didn't find much, just a few boot prints leading into the woods, but they couldn't track down anyone. Whatever that thing was, I'm certain it was human. There's been a request for eerie or unexplained stories about graveyards, and I definitely have one to share. I'm from Taipei, and I work at Yongkang Cemetery, one of the most overcrowded cemeteries in the region. Established in 1890, this private cemetery on the outskirts of the city is an impressive sight. Even though I've lived here my whole life, the grandeur of the place never fails to amaze me. Built into the hillside with terraces connected by winding stairs, it almost feels like a huge outdoor theater. My story begins just before the Ghost Festival, which is similar to our version of Tomb Sweeping Day. This tradition, which happens in mid-August, goes back over 1,000 years to the Tang Dynasty. Families visit their ancestors' graves to clean them and pay their respects. It's not just about remembering the dead, though. It's also a matter of family pride. A well-maintained grave reflects well on the living relatives. Due to the severe overcrowding at the cemetery, where some families pay over $25,000 for a burial plot, we often have to prepare well in advance before the festival. Last summer, I was tasked with relocating some remains to make space for newer burials, something I had never done before and was dreading. Moving someone's remains is considered taboo, and the job is physically exhausting. Wearing layers of protective gear during the hottest, most humid time of year, we had to be extremely careful. Our task was to move the remains down several flights of stone stairs without losing even a single speck of dust or bone. One early morning, I donned my mask, goggles, and protective suit. In my language, there's a special term for this gear, but the best way to describe it is like a forensic outfit. I spent the first 8 hours just removing the top layer of the old grave. Since we had to move both the remains and the grave intact, the process was slow and delicate. The grave I worked on had been neglected for years, its headstone worn down to the point where the name was unreadable. I figured the family might use the money they received to clean it up. The next day was the hard part, collecting the bones. I spent hours gently retrieving each bone from the rotten coffin. It was grueling work, both physically and mentally. You can't help but think about your own mortality when you're faced with a person's remains. Working at a cemetery regularly dulls that feeling since most of the job involves routine maintenance. But handling another human's bones brings death back to the forefront in a very real way. It's a reminder of how fragile life is, how temporary we all are. Now, I should mention that I'm not someone who believes in ghosts or the supernatural, but what happened next left me puzzled. After starting this task, I began having strange dreams. In these dreams, I was at the cemetery working when I would meet a young woman visiting a grave. She was beautiful and tall, wearing traditional clothes that were uncommon for someone her age in Taipei. The dream was so vivid that I woke up remembering her name, Lian Mei. The dreams came and went over the next few nights. I didn't think much of them until it came time to repaint the name on the tombstone. We had to check some old records to find the name of the person buried in that plot. These records were ancient and handwritten, stored in a dusty old archive. Without the organized system they used, we would have taken forever to find what we needed. When I finally found the record, my heart skipped a beat. The last name was Lin, and the middle name was Yen. It instantly reminded me of the woman in my dreams. The only relief I felt was when I saw the last name wasn't Mei, but Shan. Still, the coincidence of the last and middle names being the same was enough to unsettle me. The dreams gradually stopped after we finished moving the remains and sealing the grave. I haven't seen Lian Mei in my dreams since, but I still can't fully explain why those dreams happened. Maybe it was just my mind's way of coping with the stress of the job, but even when I try to rationalize it, I still get chills thinking about the whole experience. I used to be a funeral director. Here's a little background first. The graveyard I worked at was incredibly old, at least a couple hundred years. It has to be because the nearby church was built in the 1600s. Being a rural area, most burials back then were marked with wooden crosses, not stone or marble headstones. Over time, the crosses decayed, and new people were buried. Nowadays, fewer people live around the area, so the cemetery's budget has shrunk, and the place has become quite overgrown. It's a peaceful spot, but also kind of sad to see. You can imagine, after centuries of burials in the same small plot, the soil has been turned over many times. Now, it's mostly made up of bone fragments. If you try to rake the flower beds, you're likely to dig up a tooth or a bone here or there. The earth in the graveyard looks a lot like the sandy dirt you'd find at the beach, but instead of seashells, the pale bits you see are broken pieces of bones. It's not really scary, just unsettling, but you get used to it after a while. We would handle any human remains we found respectfully, usually tucking them back into the soil under a plant or something. One day, someone tending to a family member's grave decided to clear the area around it. The locals in this area prefer a neat, raked look to grass, sort of like a small garden. While raking, they pulled up a clump of bright white hair from the ground. They must have been shocked because they quickly left, leaving the cemetery worker to discover the hair poking out from the soil. The worker reported it to the church, and they supposedly reburied the remains. Despite my experience in the industry, I still can't explain why the hair was so close to the surface. But there's another experience that stands out even more. My colleague and I had just returned to the funeral home after picking up the body of a 27-year-old woman who had passed away from cancer. As we transferred her from the stretcher to the embalming table, we heard a distinct click, and the old radio across the room suddenly turned on, blasting static at full volume. It's one of those radios where you have to turn the dial until it clicks to turn it on. We both looked at each other, startled. My colleague was quite religious, and the incident visibly unsettled him. He made an excuse to leave early. After he left, I turned off the radio since I usually used my phone to play music while I worked. Later, when I was finishing up and moving the woman's body to the dressing table, I heard that same click again, and the radio blared to life once more. At that point, I was pretty freaked out and decided to leave too. My colleague and I never talked about it, and nothing like that ever happened again during my time there. Years back, my father bought a small burial ground when I was in middle school. I worked there through my high school years. My tasks included lawn care, mowing, weeding, and tending to flower beds. Besides seeing occasional shadows out of the corner of my eye or hearing strange noises, the graveyard was actually a calm and peaceful place. But the strangest experience was dealing with burials in the crypts. We would dig about 5 or 6 feet down to reveal large stone slab doors. After removing the heavy stone, you'd drop down into a cold, dark room. These chambers could hold 2 full-size coffins, or up to 4 small ones for children. The hardest ones were often crypts that stored decades' worth of cremated remains. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was common for families to buy one crypt for everyone to be cremated and placed inside. Some families would simply seal the remains, but others would leave behind candles, mementos, flowers, and photos. It was eerie to open one of these crypts after over 50 years and find melted candles, old photos, and personal items of the deceased. Eventually, after enough times going down there, you have a strange realization. You're surrounded by bodies, and one day you'll be among them. Another time, my best friend and I were earning extra money over the summer as groundskeepers while we were in high school. The job was pretty easy, earning $5 an hour to clean, trim, and keep the place neat. We raked a lot of leaves, dug some holes, and got to drive around the grounds in a small, modified golf cart with tools in the back. There were often dead flowers to clear away, along with empty beer cans, liquor bottles, and sometimes even used condoms. There was a widow who left handwritten notes on her husband's grave, but most of them were unreadable. And there were soaked stuffed animals on children's graves that we had to throw away. It felt so wrong to toss those things in the trash. And believe me, it was even worse than digging holes. Rainy days were frustrating since it rained a lot, but overall it was an easy gig. The creepiest thing I saw was an old baby doll left on a grave. It wasn't particularly spooky at first, but what unsettled us was that the doll had been badly burned, as though someone had taken a blowtorch to it. On top of that, large iron nails had been driven into its eyes. It was probably a prank by some local college kids, maybe even my friend, though he never admitted it. Either way, it really disturbed me when I came across it one early morning when no one else was around. But there was something far worse I encountered during that job. One foggy Saturday morning, I stumbled upon the body of a young woman, around my age, lying there with her arms at her sides. She had been strangled right there. Whoever killed her had also badly beaten her. She was quickly identified as a student from a nearby school, but her clothes were never found, and to my knowledge, the case was never solved. My friend and I were questioned by the police twice. Honestly, the scariest part was being treated as suspects in a murder. We had no idea what happened and each had an alibi, so we were eventually cleared. Thankfully, the authorities didn't bother us after that. I just hope that she's resting in peace. My name is Kelly, and I'm 22 years old now. I spent a lot of time in a nearby graveyard. I know it sounds strange, but it's a very old, historically important place, and sometimes it feels more peaceful to be among the dead than the living. One of the oddest things about this particular cemetery is a small area off to the side with several very old graves, marked only by 3-digit numbers. I'm not exactly sure how many there are, but I've seen the numbers go well beyond 300. Some of these graves have small flags next to them, signaling that the person was a veteran of foreign wars, but no names or dates are listed alongside the numbers. I never really figured out why they were just numbered without names. I assume it's for people whose identities were lost, which must be an awful fate, being erased from history like that. In a nearby section, there's a grave without a number but with a name, dates of birth and death, and a birthplace. Everything is written in Greek. Once, I used my phone to translate it, and it turned out that the person was born far away in Relocating, Greece. Their last name matches another Greek grave across the cemetery. The birth years differ, ranging from around 1900 to 1983, but all the death dates are the same. Hundreds of people passed away on the same day. I've tried to figure out what might have caused this, but no research or online search has given me any answers. In a newer section of the cemetery, there's a grave with notes left beside it, written by the wife of the man buried there. It's not just one note. Some days there are hundreds, all handwritten and stuck on the grave like ongoing conversations with her husband. They often contain only a few words, scribbled in a way that looks rushed, as if she's regularly coming back to speak to him. Or perhaps it could be a sister, but I'll likely never know for sure. Also, I've seen things and felt odd presences while walking alone through the graves. To be clear, I don't believe in ghosts. I consider myself agnostic, unsure about the existence of God as many people describe him. I find it silly to think of God as an old man with a white beard, watching everything from above. But I do believe there are things in the world we just can't explain yet. It's like in the past when scientists didn't understand why the sun seemed to move across the sky. More than once, I've been standing at a grave, looking at the intricate carvings, when suddenly a bird swooped down and perched on the gravestone or the grave itself. I've seen cats acting strange too, meowing and pawing at the air like they're fixated on something I couldn't see. I'm sure there's a logical explanation for all this, but it's hard not to get caught up in your thoughts during a quiet walk through a cemetery. Let me tell you, it can be intense. The story is about a young teen, around 17 years old, working as a caretaker at a remote cemetery in a small southern town. The job was a simple summer gig, involving tasks like cleaning dirt and grime from gravestones. To describe the setting, the cemetery was mostly flat land dotted with tombstones and surrounded by thick woods, which gave it an isolated, eerie feeling. There was one small building on site with restrooms for the caretakers, and a modest mausoleum where some of the wealthier families were entombed. Given the unsettling environment, the teen often felt nervous, partly due to a love of horror movies. One evening, while making the usual rounds, the teen noticed something strange about the mausoleum. Something felt off, like there was someone else around. Approaching the building, the teen spotted candlelight flickering inside and heard voices. Young voices, like other teens, laughing and giggling in an odd way. Although no one had been seen entering or leaving the cemetery, the teen didn't feel confident enough to confront a group alone, especially if they were possibly intoxicated. Instead, a security guard was called for backup. The guard, a retired cop, arrived quickly, and together they entered the mausoleum. Strangely, no one was there. The voices had stopped, but candles were still burning around one of the tombs. This tomb, disturbingly, had been opened to reveal a child-sized skeleton, along with a creepy, old-fashioned doll lying next to the remains. The doll looked hand-knitted, its unsettling smile frozen in place. Feeling unsettled, the caretaker and the guards searched the cemetery, trying to catch whoever had desecrated the grave, but saw no one. After searching for about 15 minutes, they returned to the mausoleum to reseal the tomb. As they re-entered, they noticed something even more disturbing. The doll that had been placed beside the skeleton was now sitting upright on the other side of the mausoleum, as if someone had moved it. The same eerie smile was stitched across its face. Spooked by the whole experience, the teen quit the job the very next day, never returning to the cemetery, not even for a visit.